Hello, nerds for Yang.
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds!
Now with this campaign, bang, dang, it's and Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds!
Welcome to the show, Aaron Hamlin from the Center for Election Science. How are you doing today?
Doing well, thank you. Yourself?
I'm fantastic. I'm excited to have this conversation. You know, a lot of people who supported Yang were really excited about some of the things he was talking about with respect to campaign finance reform and ranked choice voting and kind of like upgrading the fundamentals of how the democracy works. And when I came across the Center for Election Science, I was like, well, it looks like these guys think about this kind of stuff a lot. We should get them on the show. So thank you for agreeing to come on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us.
So before we get into ranked choice and plurality and approval voting and all those kind of different approaches, maybe we could start with just a little bit of background about you, Aaron, and the Center for Election Science.
Sure. Personally, I have a social science background. I have 2 graduate degrees in social sciences as well as a law degree. I've set up multiple nonprofits. I'm one of the founders for the Center for Election Science. With the Center for Election Science itself, I'm very excited about our mission. We empower voters by giving them a meaningful tool so that they have a voice that forces government to listen to them. And we fortunately have a great tool to do this that performs well and is also fortunately simple as well relative to the other options that are out there.
Got it. So when you say it's a tool, do you mean it's a framework, or are you talking about like a specific piece of software? Like, what do you mean? What is the tool that you guys have?
So when I talk about a tool, I'm talking about the voting method itself, which I suppose it's worth taking a step back and clarifying here when I use the word voting method. Like, it's used very broadly in a number of contexts. So when you go to fill out your ballot, you see the ballot in front of you and it says choose one candidate, and then you go put it in the ballot box, and then they tally it up in terms of whoever had the most votes wins. So the voting method itself is has multiple components. One is the expression element, so what information you put on that ballot, and then the voting method takes that information and calculates it somehow to produce a result. Those components there, the information you put on the ballot, and how it's calculated to produce a result, that's the voting method. There are a whole bunch of different ones. And so when we talk about a tool, we're talking about the particular voting method that we're using to help empower voters.
Got it. And the voting methods that we've been using so far, in my recollection, they really haven't changed that much, or have they evolved over the last several decades, or has it pretty much been the same method all along?
I mean, largely, when we think about voting, the choose one voting method that we have is pretty ubiquitous, particularly when we're talking about single winner elections, things like mayor, governor. In the U.S., we elect our entire legislature using single winner methods as well. We intermixed throughout the years. We've seen other alternative voting methods come into play, but predominantly the choose one method that we have now, called plurality voting or first past the post, is pretty dominant.
And what do you think is wrong? Is there anything wrong with that, or what's the limitation of the first method?
Well, the choose one method that we use now is pretty horrific in about every imaginable way, other than being simple. It does have that going for it. But when we, for one, when we think about that expression element, you're not really given the opportunity to have a say on candidates. You're forced to choose just one candidate. Even if you like other candidates, the voting method says, nope, you can't do that. If you try to do that, we will throw your ballot away and it won't count for anything. So you have issues like vote splitting that can occur. You see that particularly in primaries. So imagine if there are a bunch of candidates that you like, that you think represent you well. Well, you can't express that opinion with the choose one voting method. You have to choose just one of them. And as a consequence, the vote can divide between those candidates, and someone else can win that is not as popular, but they win merely because they don't have their vote divided. That can also cause more partisan winners. It can lead to an inaccurate reflection of support for certain candidates. So say there's a candidate that you really like, and maybe they're newer, they don't have the same kind of treasure trove as some other candidates. You may be tempted not to vote for them because you don't want to waste your vote. You want to vote for one of the front runners to make sure that at least you have a say in the outcome. But by doing that, it also means that you don't get to show support for that candidate. And that means their ideas are less likely to get traction over time, which is terrible. I mean, we want a low barrier to entry. We want new ideas, particularly ones that are good, to be able to gain traction. But our choose one voting method really hampers that pretty severely.
So is it a recent thing that people have called out all of these limitations with the choose one, or has it always been something that people have talked about, since the beginning? It just seems like for me recently it's come up more, maybe because of this primary or this most recent primary, but I don't know, like, were the founding fathers debating this as well?
I mean, there are alternative voting methods that go back quite a while. Like, I think Condorcet method is a good example of one that's been around, like, as an idea for a while, although it doesn't have very much of a record in terms of implementation. I think I would agree that over the last several decades, we've seen more, particularly in the U.S., in terms of attention. Part of the reason that this gets much less attention than it deserves is that it appears kind of like an invisible issue. This is one of those things that when you learn about it, it's like, oh, well, yeah, this is an issue, but it's one of those things, like, kind of like being a fish in water and being asked, like, what water is. It's one of those things that just embedded into it. We just go about doing it a particular way every time. It seems very simple. It feels intuitive, like this is the way that it should be. And so as a consequence, we really don't question it a lot.
Do you ever feel like the added complexity of these alternatives would be a difficult kind of execution challenge? I'm just reviewing or reminiscing about Iowa caucus and how, in theory, Iowa is supposed to be an expert in caucus voting. And, obviously we didn't see results for weeks, I feel like, after they had the caucus.
Well, you're not going to get me as being a big proponent of caucuses. But that is a good question relating to the complexity of different voting methods. So, like, we've just only been talking about this choose one voting method so far, which is the one that we're used to using. And I mentioned Condorcet methods, which are among the more complicated ones. But there's a wide array in terms of complexity with these methods. So you've got, like, this choose one method, which is easy. You've got this expression element, pick one candidate, and then just simply adding. Like, that's the calculation in the background, just adding up the votes. You've got, say, like, mentioned Condorcet before. Condorcet, you are ranking candidates, and those rankings are used to simulate head-to-head elections or pairwise comparisons, kind of like you would think of like a round robin tournament kind of approach. And then if there isn't someone who can beat all the candidates, they go through some much more complicated approaches to figure out who the winner is. So you've got kind of like that end of the spectrum of being really complicated, particularly those tiebreaker components, versus the other end of the spectrum, methods that really require simple addition.
Right. Well, one of the things that your team sent me in advance was a chart looking at I think it was like the primary results if we had approached it with some different voting methodologies. Do you mind if I throw that up and we talk it through?
Totally, yeah.
All right, let's see if I can share this tab here. This infogram. What does this mean? What is this thing?
So around, I believe it was November, we had done a poll asking respondents who were intending to vote in the Democratic primary. And we asked them to vote under multiple different voting methods. We asked them to vote under our choose one method. We asked them to vote under ranked choice voting, also known as instant runoff voting. And we also asked them to vote under approval voting. So I suppose it's worth stating what those other two methods are to kind of start off. So ranked choice voting, also known as instant runoff voting, it's used in Maine now and a number of other states. A number of other cities, like particularly in California, Oakland, San Francisco, and then some others scattered throughout the U.S. And so the way that ranked choice voting works is you rank your candidates. So from first to last, it can kind of so when you have this in front of you as a ballot, you have like the total. You have kind of a grid, so you have the total number of candidates running, and then on the kind of the x-axis of your ballot, you have the order that you're selecting for each candidate, and so that can get kind of daunting as a ballot size because you have like if you have 8 candidates, so you got 8 down, 8 across. So in many cases, as a practical matter, they truncate the ballot so that you can only rank, for instance, 3. And this, however, we allowed respondents to rank as many candidates as they want. So there's that ranking element. And so we mentioned before, you got a voting method, you have this expression element, here it's ranking, then you've got the calculation element. So for ranked choice voting, the calculation element, it takes those rankings and then it goes through this kind of algorithm. The first part is asking, okay, does anyone have more than 50% of the first choice preferences? If yes, you've got a winner. If no, it goes to a second sequence, which asks, okay, who has the fewest number of first choice preferences, takes that candidate, and then moves over their second choice preferences to the next candidate, treats that as first choice preference, and then retallies the vote again. And then goes back and re-asks that question. Okay, now out of the remaining ballots we have, does anyone have more than half of the first choice preferences? If yes, you got a winner. If no, you keep going through that until you have someone who does have more than 50% of the remaining ballots. And I say remaining ballots because some of these ballots can get exhausted over time by not filling out the remainder of their rankings. And so here, what we've done is we've shown, so if you look in the red part, what we've shown is the most amount of support that a candidate has before they're eliminated. So this shows a candidate in their best possible light. So like the most support that they could possibly get before they're eliminated. And then, so that's ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting. Approval voting, put this over on the more simple of the voting methods. With approval voting, you merely pick as many candidates as you want or approve of, and the candidate with the most votes wins. And so what you're seeing here is the percentage of ballots in which a candidate is approved. And so, like, if you like look at Elizabeth Warren, she's like at like 74%, I believe. Sanders is in like the mid 60s, and then downward from there. So give you an idea of what we're looking at here. Here we asked these 1,400 respondents, and we used a within subject design. And what that means is that for each respondent, we asked them how they would vote for each different voting method. So there wasn't like some group of people we asked about plurality voting, some group of people we asked about ranked choice voting. We asked the same people about all the different methods, and that for the research methodology and stats folks out there, it helps to reduce random error. It gives us a better measurement to deal with.
So when I'm looking at this, is it the correct interpretation that the people wanted Elizabeth Warren more than anyone else?
At this snapshot in time, yes.
Interesting. And when you think about approval versus ranked choice, do you feel what are like the pros and cons of each?
So with approval is by far a simpler method because you're just simply adding. So it has that going for it. The ballot design is much easier. You don't have to worry about like this kind of complicated grid or truncating the amount of information that a voter can supply, which can interfere with the outcome if you're limiting the amount of information the voter can offer. The other thing is that with approval voting, it's also using that information better. And so, for instance, with approval voting, and you can see this with the green on there, we also added this other component where we had a control measure to ask the respondents how much they supported an individual candidate, regardless of viability. And so we see here that approval voting actually does a much better job of getting close to that control measure as well. And so you look, for instance, down the list, you can see some candidates here, including Yang. So like you look at, say, like RCV in terms of how Yang did under RCV right before he was eliminated, not a whole lot better than under plurality voting. Whereas approval voting, all that information about Yang is captured there. So all the voters that supported him, all that is captured by the voting method, and all of that is reflected there. So the reflection of support is better captured under approval voting versus RCV as a big one. Here, the winner between RCV and approval voting really didn't change. So we see the same winner there. Interestingly, here there's a vote splitting going on under plurality voting. So with this particular sample, it was kind of difficult to differentiate between several of the front runners under plurality voting.
Yeah. The blues look pretty similar for Warren, Sanders, and Biden, but the greens are quite different, and the reds as well. Is that common to see the RCV and approval kind of tracking each other in terms of the ultimate result?
It can happen in a number of cases. So when we did this, we did samples for the Democratic primary in 2 occasions. This one in November, and then another one right before Super Tuesday. And both of them, RCV and approval voting chose the same winner with those two. If we looked at this state by state or did additional polling throughout the election year, it's quite possible, particularly given this scenario with all these candidates, that a different winner could have been chosen at a particular point. So that part, in terms of winner selection, that tended to be consistent among both of the samples that we had taken. But one stark difference, as you can see, is that reflection of support for the candidates. That's something that we see a consistent difference.
For the thing that you did on Super Tuesday, what was the result?
On Super Tuesday, we had Sanders in there as the leader for that particular one.
Oh, I think I found it. Let me pull that one up. Hold on a second. Let's share the screen on that guy, Super Tuesday. I think it might be this one.
And our site, it says Super Tuesday Deep Voting Methods Dive.
Yeah. Okay, I think I got it up now.
Yep. And Warren is in second in that particular one.
Yeah, so on approval, he wins, and RCV, he wins. Okay, so you've got Sanders, then you got Buttigieg, Blumey. Let's see, is our man Andrew on there? Oh no, I guess Andrew had already dropped out by then.
That's right. Yeah, that's why I thought you would like the earlier one. So I wanted to make sure that you got to see that one.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you including in that one. So, like, what do you think is the biggest pushback for making this happen? It seems like approval is not that complicated. Like, people could understand it pretty easily, and it seems like it might capture more of the will of the people.
Yeah. So for us, our main barrier has been that we're a bit kind of newer to the scene. The positive end is that we move quickly. So as an example, in 2018, like we got our initial funding, and within a year of that, we hired staff and we got approval voting implemented in its first U.S. city, the city of Fargo, North Dakota. And which is really an incredible story. There, it was they were really plagued by vote splitting within their city commission, and they were seeing people win with like under 30% of the vote. It was just ridiculous. They had their commission went and created a task force to try to address the vote splitting. One of the members of that task force had reached out to us and said, "Hey, I see that you are supporting approval voting. I think that's going to be able to help our community in terms of addressing all this vote splitting and making sure that we have people that represent us." Went back and then got the rest of the task force on board, recommended it to the commission. The commission just sat on their hands for like a year, which is crazy. It's worth perhaps noting that one of the people on the commission at the time was one of the people who also won with like 22% of the vote. So they weren't really inclined to make any kind of action. This particular person, Jed Lemke, was a bit annoyed by this and then went and wound up gathering signatures, getting it on the ballot, and then working with us. And that initiative passed by 63.5%.
Wow. It just occurred to me that if the Republican primaries in 2016 had approval voting, it might have resulted in a different nominee.
I think that is quite realistic. The current voting method also tends to choose more. It gives a benefit to more extreme candidates as well. And the reason for that is because you can have vote splitting around the middle. And so if a candidate is in the middle, they can have vote splitting on either side of them. So candidates that kind of fall on either side of their political spectrum. Whereas a candidate that is a bit more extreme, they only have their vote split on one side and they pick up the kind of tail end of the extremes and they get everyone on the tail end as well.
Right. And I think your team, Dominique, sent me something. What was it? The squeeze, the center squeeze?
Yes.
Let's see. So that's what you're talking about, where if you are a candidate that appeals to bits of both sides, you actually are most damaged with the current system.
That's right. Yeah. Particularly when you have a lot of people in the race, like you see this exasperated. And this can also happen with ranked choice voting as well. I think ranked choice voting does a bit of a better job in terms of addressing this, but it's still nonetheless vulnerable, because here we can imagine this with like our normal choose one voting, but in the same way that can split, first choice preferences can also split, and because that ranked choice voting method knocks out the candidate with the fewest first choice votes, you have the same kind of effect that can occur. And we've seen that happen in real life elections. For instance, in Burlington, Vermont, we had seen that. And then there's another election that used a jungle primary in Louisiana. It was a gubernatorial election. And that one, it was basically a three-way race where there was a runoff, and we saw the same kind of center squeeze effect. And we know, and it's pretty clear there's a center squeeze effect because the candidate who was knocked out in the first round could also beat the other two candidates head to head. And what's kind of that particular election, which is in 1991, it was in Louisiana, was for the gubernatorial election. You had Buddy Roemer, who's kind of was a kind of moderate incumbent, and then you had Edwin Edwards, which is a very corrupt politician, and David Duke, who's a pretty racist Klansman. So you had this very peculiar three-way race. Buddy Roemer got knocked out, and then Edwin Edwards and David Duke went on to the runoff, where it was, you had strange bumper stickers that would say things like vote for the lizard, not the wizard. And Edwin Edwards actually went on to win. But it's maybe interesting to note that in that election, the election that Edwin Edwards won, he would later be sent to prison for felonies that he committed while in office for that election that he won. So we get these kind of peculiar center squeeze effects and vote splitting phenomena that occur in real life. And in that particular election, ranked choice voting actually would have demonstrated the same result because of that center squeeze effect, as we saw with that kind of traditional runoff. So.
Aaron, let me ask you a question from Aluminium, who wanted to get your thoughts on approval voting versus score voting. What is your take on that?
So approval voting falls within the class of type of cardinal systems where you are applying cardinal scores. Technically, with approval voting, it's you can think of it as like a 0 to 1 score for each individual candidate. Score voting, also known as range voting, what that does is it just kind of increases the sensitivity for that measurement. So instead of like yes or no for a particular candidate, you increase the scale to say like 0 to 3 or 0 to 5. And so you're asked to indicate your support for a candidate on that scale, where a higher number is more support. And so that voting method technically does perform a little bit better in terms of winner selection, a little bit better as well in terms of capturing candidate support, but it does so at the cost of a bit of complexity relative to approval voting. Still, like with the range voting, you're looking at average scores to determine the winner, or you can do it as summative and just say like the highest score wins. But you have things like you change the ballot design a bit. So with approval voting, you keep much of the same ballot design. Range voting, you've got a little bit of a change in ballot design. It's a little bit more involved for the voter as well to go and score each individual candidate. And then the other component is you have to do a little bit of setup in terms of like looking at the voting machines that you're using. Whereas with approval voting is one of those shovel-ready interventions. So when you're looking at different voting methods, you have to consider the practical elements as well, and how much performance you're getting for those kind of complexity costs and practical costs that you're adding.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that's one of those things where you could always find systems that are more precise, but if it's way more complex and harder to explain and sell and implement, it may not be worth it, especially if it, like, maybe 90% of the time it results in the same outcome anyway as, say, approval might.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, considering the diminishing returns that you're including for those extra costs.
So Heidi has a question about star voting. Do you have any thoughts on star voting?
I would say star voting is a more extreme example of range voting in terms of getting diminishing returns for the extra complexity cost. There you have the scoring function, but then you're, in addition to that, I don't know if you can hear my cat. He wants, I think
he wants to come in or he wants to leave?
He wants in.
Well, if you need to let him in, go for it. That's fine. We're talking about star voting.
With star voting, you have this scoring element, but then on top of that, it simulates a runoff, which uses the two highest scores and then transforms those scores into pairwise comparisons, which simulates the runoff component. So again, like, you have this extra complexity that's being added there. And then you've also got that little extra with the slightly more complicated ballot design. And then you've got the issue of the added cost, which is a very real cost. Like, if a city wants to change its voting method, you've got all the costs of implementing that voting method. So you've got those added costs there, the complexity costs, and, like, thinking about approval voting, well, like, it doesn't cost anything to implement, and then you're getting these really great performances without paying all these extra kind of fees or costs.
So what's the game plan, Aaron? How do you get this? I mean, from what you've shared so far, approval voting certainly seems like an improvement over the pick one kind of approach, especially with the polarization of politics lately. It just seems like we end up, to your point, with these extreme, candidates. How do we get there? It seems like daunting to get anything done with government. Changing how government selects its representatives seems even more daunting. What are your thoughts?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, we really need a voting method that does a good job at electing a consensus candidate. And then, like, one other kind of bonus of approval voting is that it has the ability to identify when there's a candidate that can really show a mandate. So someone who wins can really clearly show their support, and that can offer them the kind of political capital that's just not simply offered to them in our choose one voting method, where that support can just be completely lost, and give them the courage and ability to really go through and push meaningful reform. But the question that you ask in terms of, like, okay, well, this sounds great, how does this actually happen? So fortunately, we have a really wonderful team with our staff. And like I mentioned before, within a year of getting our initial funding in 2018, we got approval voting implemented in its first U.S. city within a year. I mean, that's pretty crazy. Yeah. And that they had their first election for their commission. That was just over a month ago now. And so we didn't even slow down after helping the folks in Fargo. And we've since worked with the folks in St. Louis, Missouri. There, they had a terrible issue with vote splitting, particularly among the Black community. So there, they have closed primaries, and so they had a number of people from the Black community running, and then the vote was just split among all of those candidates, and so none of them had won. And so now you have an issue of, like, okay, what does the person is the person who actually won, are they someone that actually represents the community? And so that was a big issue in St. Louis. And so when people from that community had reached out to us and said, hey, one, like, we can't consider these other voting methods because our city doesn't have the funds to implement them, but we do need a solution at the same time, and we can't wait. And so we since started working with them. Now that's on the ballot for this November. So approval voting on the ballot in St. Louis in this November. And so far it looks really good. And for next steps, we have chapter systems set up all across the country, which anyone who wants to go to our site at electionscience.org, they can become involved with a chapter. And there, like, we are just working city by city, working with people in the community to make sure that we can just bring it to the next city.
So tell me a little bit, Aaron, about the results from these cities. So the Fargo folks who did they implemented it, like, did they encounter any problems, or what was the reaction after it was done? And how do you educate the voters? Because they've been voting all their lives to pull the lever for one, and now you're saying, what, I can vote for more than one? Was that hard for them to transition?
Well, so this is something where, and it reiterates why it's important to really intimately involve the community that you're working with, because ultimately you're empowering that community and making sure that they see this tool as their own, something that helps them to enact this change. And so the group in Fargo, North Dakota that ultimately passed this measure also acted as part of the education campaign, letting people know that this was an option that they had to do, where if they saw that more than one candidate represented them, that they could choose more than one. Here was a little bit of a different case because two people were elected in this particular election. Kind of classically, approval voting is used to elect one person, but here voters were able to choose as many as they want, and two people were elected for the commission. And in the past, what we had seen was a number of we would see the winners win with this paltry amount of support, but in this case, both the person who came in first and second, so the two winners, both of them had over 50% approval, which was something that just did not see previously. They in previous elections, they would not even get above 40%. Neither one. So,
yeah. Do you ever do you think there would actually be more people that ran for office if there were approval voting? I feel like one of the dynamics now is if someone's thinking of running, they'll kind of see who else is in the field, and they'll be like, oh, well, so-and-so is already running, so that race is kind of too congested. Whereas with approval voting, like, actually, you could still go for it, and people who like you and the front runner can vote for both in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's one of the things that we were seeing in St. Louis. I mean, the idea of like people from the community running, and then like you have all kinds of different perspectives that people, I mean, deserve to have people that represent them. And as voters and people in the community, we're the ones who benefit from seeing that diverse array of candidates. I mean, that's the only way that we get to see those ideas. And so if you are using this terrible choose one voting method that we have now, and you're fearing that maybe even though you agree with some of the other candidates, that if you run, that you'll cause that platform as a whole just to fall. Of course, that's going to disincentivize you from running. And then there's the added issue of, okay, well, if you do run and perhaps you don't have the same kind of name recognition, but you have good ideas that you're bringing to the table, well, now you got to take on like people calling you a spoiler, people pushing you to drop out. And these are things that no one wants to have to go through. And on top of all that, to have your reward be this minuscule amount of support that you know doesn't represent you. And so approval voting puts that on its head. If you're running and other people are similar to you, you can say, hey, like, if you like me, you can vote for me. But if you want to make sure that you're not splitting your vote, you can vote for these other folks at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're also making sure that your ideas get that accurate measure of support. And when people are voting for you, they're not having to think, okay, well, I don't know that this person's going to win. Well, if they like your ideas, they can support you. They don't have to worry about you being a spoiler, because if they fear that maybe you're not as contentious in terms of being able to win, they can also look at those front runners at the same time, hedge their bets, and support one of them at the same time.
So what's the reaction been like from the political parties? I could see an argument maybe quietly that the Republicans wish they had approval voting. And to some extent, a lot of Democrats are not thrilled with the outcome of the current sort of race in terms of the nominee. Is there openness? Like, have you had engagement with the usual suspects?
I think it's a little bit new to them still. And there are some conflicts of interest with getting a voting method implemented that is different than the voting method that got you elected, which is a big reason why we use ballot initiatives rather than asking them for permission. Yeah. We don't ask for permission. But that said, I think there are certainly benefits to people that want to come in and change the system, particularly independents and third parties. They get a much better reflection of support under approval voting than our current method, as well as some alternative voting methods. But in terms of benefits directly to the parties, certainly within their primaries, if they want a candidate that better reflects the will of the people within their party, they're less likely to get an extreme candidate out of that. They also get a better idea. Candidates themselves also want this information. So if they see that one of the other people running is doing particularly well on an idea, it may be that they look at that and say, like, you know what, it sounds like that idea has traction, and I can see that the people that voted for that candidate also voted for me. And so perhaps this is an issue that I need to pay attention to. So there's that added information component. And then one issue that can be challenging for someone in office is that if they win a race in which there's a lot of vote splitting and they just kind of narrowly get a win out of it, you don't have the same kind of political capital there. So whereas in an election where vote splitting is addressed under approval voting, there, when you win, you can get that much more accurate reflection of support. And so you can see whether, say, 60 or 65% of people approved of you. And if that's the case, now you have the political capital to actually get things done. Whereas under a choose one method, like, good luck getting stuff done when you won with like 40% of the vote. You just don't have the political capital that you would under approval voting, where you can say, okay, I've got this mandate. These are the things that, these are the issues that the people elected me under, and these are the issues that I'm going to get done because I have the political capital to do so.
Let me play devil's advocate with you for a second, Aaron, on the approval stuff. Could someone argue that, well, it's not really a mandate because someone said they approve of you, but you weren't, they kind of like, you barely made it. They weren't really enthusiastic about you. You don't have the enthusiasm of, let's say, if we look at the 2020 race, I think the president has made the case that he has the most enthusiastic supporters. He may not have the most supporters, but he has most enthusiastic ones. Do you feel like we end up with these kind of milquetoast, like, oh, okay, fine, I'll approve that person candidates?
Well, I mean, I think that's a reasonable hypothesis. Fortunately, it's something that's testable. So, like, we can, for instance, like, look at the polling that we had done, and we could ask the question to ourselves: okay, well, at that point in time, was Elizabeth Warren, was she a milquetoast candidate for people within the Democratic Party? was Bernie Sanders kind of a milquetoast candidate for folks within the Democratic Party. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that would be the case. If one other thing to keep in mind too, so when we think about like polling in other instances, when we look at approval voting compared to different voting methods, there are some candidates who don't do particularly well under our choose one voting method, and they also don't do particularly well under approval voting. So one thing to keep in mind is that just because we're using approval voting doesn't make a candidate good. Like that candidate at the end of the day still has to present ideas that are persuasive. And if a candidate fails to do that, even under approval voting, they're not going to be able to get much support.
Yeah, I guess if you flip it around from a candidate perspective, the strategy goes from advocating positions that activate my core base and get them super fired up, to now advocating positions that appeal to the most people, which I guess would be a good thing. Yeah. So is it fair to say, I mean, you've been very diplomatic. It doesn't sound like the RNC and DNC are like jumping into the arms of approval voting. It sounds like the people are going to have to demand it, or do you think the parties actually, some, are going to be more forward thinking and want to experiment with this?
I think one component of it is getting it implemented in more and more cities and making sure that it's on their radar. I think part of this is that it's just not on their radar yet. But we're going to help with that. So with Fargo, North Dakota, that's a city of 120,000 people. St. Louis, Missouri, that's over 300,000 people. The cities that we're looking to work with next, those prospective cities are like upwards of close to 1 million or more. So it'll be on their radar before long. But I think right now it's something that it's not necessarily something that they're thinking about just yet, but they should.
So tell me about the plans for the organization, the Center for Election Science. It sounds like you have been off to an amazing start with actually influencing some local elections already. What do you have planned for the next year?
So right now, what we, like I mentioned before, we have these chapter systems which people can join at our website at electionscience.org. And later this year, we are having people within those chapters submit formal proposals for mini grants to have them make those next steps to begin to look seriously at running these campaigns, and basically giving like an array of options across the U.S. in terms of being able to prioritize where it makes sense in terms of which communities are both ready and would benefit from approval voting.
All right, let's take a look. I'm on the electionscience.org website, and I went to take action, and then I went to join the chapter program. So basically, San Francisco and Seattle, two of my favorite cities. So you have people who can take action and basically replicate what you were saying happened in Fargo in their local community. And then your organization will provide some of the tools to help them advocate and make that happen. Like, tell me a little bit about that engagement model. Let's say I live in, small town, wherever, and I'm like, oh man, this would be great. We should use this for picking our mayor. And then I go to the site and what happened? I download some PDFs. Like, do I get any more support from the org?
Sure. Yeah. So we provide an outline in terms of what the beginning steps look like all the way to the campaign. So fortunately, we've been down this road before, so we've got some experience here. We also have a great director of campaigns and advocacy that works with each of these chapters. The chapters themselves, you get some information, and then on top of that, you'll see the next meeting, which we have it broken up by time zone, so you can see a bunch of folks within chapters throughout like your particular time zone, and then you can also look at we break people up also in terms of which city they're closest to as well. So you can see some of them on the West Coast, but we also have folks looking at the New England area as well as in Texas and in Colorado too.
Nice. And so where does the funding for the organization come from? Is it mostly individuals, or are there any large organizations or PACs or corporate interests? Like, could you share a little bit about the support for the Center for Election Science?
Sure. And one aspect that I'm proud about in terms of us setting an example with other nonprofits is under the About section of our website, we have a transparency page. And there you can look at our recent annual reports. So the last one is looking at the 2019 year. The bulk of our funding has come from Open Philanthropy Project, which looks at funding through an effective altruism lens, which uses an empirical approach to basically making the world a better place. And so the additional funding that helped us to get that win with the people in Fargo, as well as the following that to allow us to set up operations for the St. Louis campaign. A bulk of that funding came from Open Philanthropy Project. And the remainder of our funding comes from individual donors, which I'm very proud of our Director of Philanthropy, Kirsten Elliott, who, and I donate to different nonprofits as well. And so I think about my experience and I think about the experience that we're providing our donors. And I'm very proud of the relationship that we build with our donors. So we're really good about thanking our donors and making sure that they're valued. So.
Yeah. So I'm looking now at some of the. By the way, the annual report looks really nice. Well done there. So I'm looking at some of the financials. Looks like a couple million in revenue in 2019, and there is. How does that break? If it's a couple million, okay, there's. I'm not. Mostly it's direct public grants, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Right. And then what? Tell me a little bit about that public grant program for those who are not familiar with it.
So we went through a process with Open Philanthropy Project. They look at a number of organizations and projects within the effective altruism community. And so that's where that grant came from. Got it.
And then do you get any grief for, I saw some corporate names here. I mean, it doesn't sound like a big percentage of your revenue comes from those corporate donors, but do you have any, what's your take on, some people would look at that list and say, oh, that's the man getting involved.
So a lot of the corporate donors are through matching programs in particular. So when one of the, I also write a lot of essays on my personal website on effective ways to give. And if you can automatically double your donation through your employer and have your employer match your donation, that's a very efficient way of giving. And so we take advantage of that and try to make sure that our donors are aware of those opportunities to leverage their gift.
And if a corporation wanted to make a direct contribution, not matching an employee's contribution, do you all have a policy on whether you would accept it or not? Or how would you, let's say, I don't know, some tobacco company said that they wanted to give you $1 million. What would you do?
Well, when we're looking at whether it makes sense to accept a gift. We consider with where it's coming from, and then also how does this affect our ability to generate an outcome and stay true to our mission. And so for instance, like for evaluating with the tobacco company, one thing would be to consider is like, are there any kind of strings attached? Does it interfere with us with, like, is it a restricted gift? Does it interfere with us actually being able to advance our mission? And those are the kinds of the questions that we would ask ourselves in terms of whether it makes sense to accept a particular gift.
And if you got, say, $10 million from like Musk or Dorsey or Gates or one of those characters, like what would you do with it? How would you 10x the kind of impact that the Center for Election Science is having?
Absolutely. So one of the things to keep in mind is running these Bell initiatives is quite expensive. Even setting up the infrastructure to put them together. We have, when you think about other organizations within the space, like their staff is like in the dozens. They have many times more staff than we do. We have a staff of 4. We have 4 people that are doing this, along with our governance board of directors and board of advisors. But so we have a staff of 4 doing this, and so providing them with support staff would be enormously helpful. I know that we would all appreciate being able to hire additional staff, and then also being able to bring on a director of research as well. So right now, we do a lot of work with the Paris School of Economics, for instance. They were the ones that collaborated with us in the 2016 election, and also looking at the 2020 election as well, comparing different voting methods there. And then, like, I'm having to take a lot of personal time using my technical knowledge to be able to work on that. So being able to have someone separately being able to direct that research would be immensely helpful. So we are very understaffed for the world-changing work that we're doing.
Yeah, I love it. So for those of you who are watching and curious, go check out electionscience.org. I'm guessing you could probably donate to the effort. In some ways, if you guys can pull it off, $1 towards election science could have, this ripple effect that might even have more impact than donating to a particular candidate in some ways, if you could pull it off.
Definitely. And it's much more long lasting as well. So like, say like you're helping us to the point where we can work with communities within the state itself. And so we're looking at a particular state, like there, you're looking at U.S. Senate seats, U.S. House seats, governor, potentially like state legislature seats. And it's not just for that particular election cycle, like talking all the way into the future, which is much bigger bang for your buck than donating for a particular candidate within one particular election.
Yeah, especially if your candidates that you like tend to be sort of outside of the superhighway of the kind of normal establishment, then approval voting would probably benefit those kind of more innovative or less well-known candidates. Or I mean, like Yang, I bet a lot of it, when he goes, well, if he runs again in 2024, I suspect a lot of people will still hold back, saying, well, as an example, I was talking to a friend at work last year, and I was like, he's asking me who I was supporting. I was like, Yang. He's like, yeah, but who do you really think is going to win? Because you're now going to throw away your vote for Yang, because, what's the point? He's never going to get there. And had we had approval voting, I could say, well, yeah, sure, I'll check off Biden as well. But if you like Yang, you should check him off if you think he's, good for you as well.
And isn't that an offensive question? I mean, like Yeah, but like, who do you think's really gonna win?
I know.
That's
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, when you go and you look back at that data and you see like Yang getting 8 times more support than he does under plurality voting or current choose one method, it's like the problem is like right in your face at that point. So
Yeah, no, I think it's so sad that we have to first every voter has to become sort of a political pundit and fortune teller to determine who they vote for. Like when I saw interviews with Iowa and New Hampshire voters, they were like, "Well, I need to figure out who can win and all this kind of thing." And rather than who they felt aligned most with their values and had the most interesting kind of proposals and they admired the most. So I'll keep my fingers crossed, Aaron, that you guys can pull something off. It sounds like you're off to a great start. Are there any other topics that you wanted to hit that we didn't cover yet before we wrap up?
Well, one kind of, and perhaps it's a little bit technical, but with your audience, maybe they're okay with it. So we touch a little bit looking at the presidential elections, and normally it's a bit challenging because like you have the electoral college with presidential elections, and thinking about how that interfaces with an alternative voting method can be a bit tricky. So if you like, we can maybe, if you want to talk about the National Popular Vote Plan and how that may interact with alternative voting methods.
Oh, yeah. I think someone in the chat was also not complaining, but calling out some weaknesses of the Electoral College. Yeah, tell me a little bit about your thoughts on the popular vote and how that ties in.
Sure. Right now, obviously, in the U.S., we use the Electoral College, where each state gets electoral votes that they assign based on their state's popular vote. A couple of states break that up into based on the way they segment their districts for that. But the kind of issue for that is we're taking, like, remembering that we're using this choose one plurality voting method, really the worst of all the voting methods, and then we're taking that and we're nesting it within the Electoral College. So we're taking something that is truly terrible and then we're making it a little bit worse. The National Popular Vote Plan aims to taking it from a bit worse to just truly terrible. So we're getting upgraded to just truly terrible by having plurality voting or this choose one voting method for our national popular vote. And so if perhaps we're more ambitious about this and saying, okay, well, maybe I want to do a little bit better than just truly terrible with using our choose one voting method. And so the way that they get around the Electoral College by being able to integrate the national popular vote in the first place is using their National Popular Vote Plan, which utilizes something called an interstate compact. An interstate compact is an agreement between states where they say that once enough states sign on to it, this agreement, so that their electoral votes total up to greater than 270, or they hit 270, that the compact initiates. And when it initiates, the state is saying that they will assign all of their electoral votes to whomever the national popular vote winner is, regardless of their state's popular vote. So it basically nullifies the Electoral College and pushes it to the national popular vote instead. And so that's the framework that they use to push a national popular vote. And so one question is, okay, well, that's for this choose one voting method. How do you integrate that with an alternative voting method? Because it gets a little tricky. And I would say that approval voting is really the only alternative voting method that would work under that structure. And it does so for two reasons, because of really nice properties that approval voting has. One is that approval voting is what's called precinct summable, which means that you don't have to have all of the votes together in one central place. Whereas, like, for instance, like the ranked choice voting method or instant runoff voting method that we mentioned before, you actually need all those in one central location. And also you need every last vote in place before you can begin counting.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with approval voting, you can start counting with the first or second vote. And you can take sums from separate states as well and take those sums and put them together. And you really need to have that kind of flexibility and ability if you're going to do, if you're going to be counting up what the national popular vote is, but you can't do with some of these other alternative voting methods. So that's one reason that it works. The second of the two reasons is that if you're doing this, working within this compact, it doesn't require that every state sign on to this. And so say the states that sign on, all of them are using approval voting, but you've got these other remainder states that haven't signed on yet, and they're not using approval voting. Well, so you have different types of information here. You've got this choose one data, and you've got approval voting. Fortunately, approval voting you can add up with plurality votes because the data are just, they look so similar. Like you're just adding up all the tallies for each individual candidate, and you can still get a national popular vote when they're doing that, even when you're adding up kind of holdout states. And so that's the second reason why it works. Whereas, like, say you're interested in like a scoring or a ranking method or something like that. Well, how do you add up ranking data alongside choose one data in a way that actually utilizes the ranking data? And so because of that, like, you really can't use that approach with this national popular vote plan if you want to sidestep the Electoral College.
Yeah, so let me ask you a follow-up on that. So if one state A has approval voting and another one has the pick one approach, how could you compare those two outcomes? Because if I were in the second state that had the pick one approach, I would say, oh, all of your approval stuff, it's not the same as mine because this candidate got real votes and the other one they just got like approvals. Why is it that they are comparable in a way that makes it sort of fair?
So you're just adding up tallies for each individual candidate. So like if an individual candidate got approval votes with these ballots and they got choose one votes with these ballots, you just add them up. And for that holdout state, if they're saying like, well, like I'm not a big fan of approval voting or whatever, because after all, like their holdout state and we're saying that they didn't use it, it really doesn't matter like what they think because they're not the ones that are part of that 270 group that can assign their electoral votes. So that kind of holdout state doesn't have to be on board. It's really all the states that have signed on to this compact that have control because, again, like the compact as it's currently written doesn't trigger until all the states that sign on to it, that their electoral votes total up to 270 or more.
I see. Right. So you're saying if enough probably larger states agree to do this and they can get to the 270, if you have a minority of states that refuse, well, they can, but we'll get the 270 electoral votes without them. Now, of course, anybody hearing this that's from a small state might say, oh my God, this is exactly what the founding fathers didn't want. California and Florida and New York and Texas basically picking our president. I'm from Iowa or New Hampshire or Maine, and now all federal policies are going to screw the small states. This is the most anti-American thing I've ever heard. Maybe they could make that argument.
So folks that really like the Electoral College, they can totally ignore that part and say, oh, well, whatever. But for folks that are interested in using a national popular vote and wondering, okay, well, let's say we do this. Is this something that's even compatible with using a better voting method? Here we have an answer that it is, if it's a route that people choose to go down.
Got it. So you're not saying, hey, if you support approval voting, you have to support getting rid of the electoral college. You're saying that they are compatible if you do want to do both.
Correct. That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, this is super interesting, Aaron. I so appreciate you coming in. I think the audience in this live conversation has really enjoyed learning about what you're up to and sort of the growth and traction you're seeing with the Center for Election Science. So thank you for coming on. I think we'll wrap it here, and maybe we'll have you back again in the future to kind of update us on what the center is up to and your new initiatives. And if you guys are interested or watching this, go check out electionscience.org. Maybe think about starting a chapter in your city or town, and you could be one of the pioneers. If it pans out, I mean, it really could address a lot of the challenges that I think we all complain about, the polarization, the spoiler stuff, and also attracting more new, fresh candidates who, don't come from, the kind of general casting for who's going to run. So with that, I want to thank you again, Aaron, and say goodbye, nerds.
Bye, nerds.
I love it.